Tourist Trophy. Now there's a name that many of us have fond memories of, and for some of you, you might not be as familiar with. So for those who have never heard of this game, this is, as with my other retrospective essays for games like Test Drive Unlimited, Drive Club and Driver San Francisco, a look down memory lane for some of us at a game which was formative in our growing up, and for others perhaps a game that you forgot about and revisited later on, and even for some of you perhaps a game which is completely new. Maybe this is your first time hearing about it or really hearing what the game is all about, even if you have heard of it before. So what is Tourist Trophy and why am I talking about it? Well, put simply, Tourist Trophy is the Gran Turismo of bike games, except not just metaphorically, quite literally. It was developed by Polyphony, released on the PS2 in 2006, and it literally uses the physics engine, graphics engine, and even all but one of the circuits of Gran Turismo 4. So it quite literally is the Gran Turismo 4 of bike games, which is great for me, given that Gran Turismo 4 is also my favourite Gran Turismo game of the series. And you can immediately feel and see the carryover and the vibe in there as well. It has that same white colour palette, heavenly euphoric layout of Gran Turismo 4, but interestingly, it does make a couple of big changes in terms of core gameplay. Now, of course, the biggest thing that you'll first notice when playing the game is the change in physics. Having a vehicle which tilts with the horizon rather than staying flat all the time, and of course the shift of weight on the bike through corners and being able to just straight up fall off of the vehicle if you're travelling slowly. Well, all of these are very different feelings, even within a game which is, at this point, relatively old, compared to a car game. In a car game, you just stop the vehicle. That's it. In Tourist Trophy, you can easily fall off of the bike, and that's actually something which even other bike games commonly overlooked. Losing your balance in Tourist Trophy, I think, is one of the most advanced features of the game. You could also tune your riding form, lean in, lean out, various poses and riding styles, having your leg out even through a corner, more dirt bike style. But it really was the core of what made Gran Turismo so good that then made this so good. Those physics which have the great combination of being forgiving enough for new players to get into the game and enjoy it without feeling berated by how difficult it is, while at the same time being realistic enough and different from vehicle to vehicle to keep those of us who are more sim inclined or who take realism more seriously still fully engaged. It's a fine line to walk, especially when you are trying to have a game in car terms that can be played on a controller or a wheel, in bike terms not so much on the sim rig, but more so on a controller at the time. Having that balance is very difficult, pun intended. And interestingly, that lack of hardware backup is one of the main things which I'm going to talk about later on in this video. And of course I touched on that in a recent news piece video here on the channel, but I do want to revisit it for those who missed it, because it's very important for a Tourist Trophy sequel, something which Kaz has spoken on a few times throughout the years, but never really saying that much. Recently though, he said more than he has pretty much ever before, and unfortunately it's not great news. Now to me, the news which I'm going to talk about later on that he did mention ties directly into one of the things which I think is kind of undervalued about Tourist Trophy. See, you'll notice if you've watched my retrospective breakdowns and essays about games before that I don't just talk about core gameplay. I like to take it a bit further than that. We do discuss some of the best and worst points of the gameplay and why they captured our imaginations and kept us playing and gave us such a great place in our heart for nostalgia, but also are games that you can play today and that still hold up. But then I also like to take it a level deeper. I like to talk about, for example, why the game was as good as it was on the more macro scale. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to thank Ness, who many of you will know from the community, for providing some additional footage for this video, which of course was invaluable. Now, the major circuit that was taken out of this game compared to Gran Turismo 4, unfortunately for me, was my favourite track of Le Mans, Circuit de la Sarthe, which is a shame, but they did replace it with Riccardo Tormo, an interesting circuit, albeit a lot smaller than Le Mans, but still new is new, and many of the tracks which you'll see in this game are just such member berries for those of us who love those OG Gran Turismo circuits, especially if you're talking city circuits, such as my personal favourite city course we've ever had, of Seattle. Besides that though, I believe that there are two things which really made this game good. One of them I've kind of already touched on, and that is the aspect of how attainable the game feels. It doesn't berate you, it doesn't bash you over the head with difficulty, it allows somebody to understand and utilize the totally different skill set and approach required with a motorcycle compared to a car, either if you have or haven't played Gran Turismo before, and get into it very, very quickly. Now I will say, I believe Tourist Trophy does take more skill to master than Gran Turismo does, but to be fair, that's accurate to real life. Riding a motorcycle at high speed does require more confidence, skill and experience than driving a car at very high speeds. For want of a better explanation, you kind of can just jump in a car and drive fast. It might not end well, but you could do it. Whereas on a motorcycle, you might not even get to the point of driving fast or riding fast in the first place if you just come straight off the bike. So that extra element of skill, and also taking away, peeling back those layers between you and the machine, does make a huge difference. You really are one with the machine in an almost animal kind of sense, almost like you are one being. When you're on a motorbike, you flow and lean with the vehicle in a way that you simply don't in a car. On the macro scale though, the one thing that I believe really makes Tourist Trophy hold up so well is ironically something which Polyphony has almost completely lost sight of since, and when I say Polyphony I really mean Kaz. See, Kaz is a forward-thinking individual. He always has been, and that's both a blessing and a curse, at least in my opinion, because it causes him to have some great ideas, including games like this that were so formative in our childhoods, but the fine line, the dangerous line to walk when you are a visionary, someone who is always antsy and looking for the next thing to develop and do and think, is that sometimes you can lose track of the things that were already working well. Because the problem with wanting to reinvent things all the time is sometimes you simply don't need to. Reinventing something purely for the sake of it is what would ultimately end up with having wheels that aren't round anymore. Well, that's just not something that you need to change. The wheel is round, it's kind of serving its purpose, so leave it as it is. Sometimes things just work. To quote, of course, Todd Howard. But in this sense, I actually mean it. And when something just works, well, focus on the things that don't. Focus on the things that need improving, and crucially, listen to your audience. Listen to your community, because they are the ones who will give you the best feedback, even more so than developers will, because with the sheer volume of people playing the game, those are the people who will find things very quickly that don't work very well. I believe the reason why this game holds up so well is the exact same reason why Gran Turismo 4 does. It was just a good formula. And yet, Kaz didn't have the urge to completely reinvent the game in every way just because it came out 2 years after Gran Turismo 4, which he very easily could have. They changed things such as career mode, which of course is not based on the money system. You unlock bikes and win them, which of course has been used in Gran Turismo here and there, such as on the PSP. But the core of what makes the game so good, the feel, the look, the vibe, the music, the selection of vehicles, the selection of tracks, is surprisingly, for the most part, kind of untouched compared to GT4. He resisted the urge, or maybe he just didn't have the urge because it was something different, to try and reinvent the wheel again. The problem is that now every Gran Turismo game kind of feels like it is trying to reinvent the wheel, to the point where GT Sport was so different to all of the other Gran Turismo games before it that many of us did not like it, or at least didn't like significant aspects of the game. GT7 even, a game which is quite deliberately trying to look to the past for inspiration, still can't help itself but try and reinvent things all over the place, sometimes to good effect and sometimes not. It's the curse of being a future-thinking, for the lack of a better expression, visionary. I do think Kaz is a good dude overall. I think he has some great ideas, and let's be honest, we wouldn't be as annoyed by the bad ideas if we didn't love the good ones in the first place so much to begin with. So clearly he has it in him to make genius games, and I believe Tourist Trophy is one of them. But that brings me to the problem with the sequel. See, recently I made a video about a potential sequel to Tourist Trophy, and it was based on Kaz's relatively recent interview interviews with a number of Japanese gaming journalists, wherein they specifically asked him about it. Because in these interviews, he mentioned point blank that the only thing holding back a Tourist Trophy 2 is the hardware. Having a satisfactorily authentic feeling equivalent in a Tourist Trophy 2 to a sim racing wheel for Gran Turismo. That's both an understandable thing and a cool goal to work towards, but also something which could potentially hobble a sequel forever, or at least a very long time. Having that goal of trying to make it realistic is great, but you can't forget that the original wasn't successful because we were able to play it with a realistic rig, because we simply weren't. We loved the original anyway, and we loved the original Gran Turismo games long before realistic wheels were even a thing. So having these as these additional experiences for those who want it is great, but the danger is that this forward thinking, always wanting to achieve perfection or the closest to it, can actually end up that you make nothing instead. And although some people might say, well, it's better to wait and make something good than throw something out that's not finished, I agree with that sentiment, but let's be honest, Kaz, in his words, said that Tourist Trophy 2 could easily be released based on Gran Turismo 7's engine, much like the first game was for GT4. So that means, well, even if you do just release it without any wheel support and have Gran Turismo 7 with bikes, well, you already know it's going to be at the very least very fun then. It's going to look great, it's going to have a good selection of tracks and bikes, the physics are going to be damn good. Even if you remade the physics of the first game, they hold up pretty damn well, but of course they would be better. So it would be a great game. The only thing that is holding it back is not that it would be a bad game. It wouldn't be a rushed, half-assed attempt at a game. It would simply be a game that doesn't have that one thing that Kaz wants, which is the hardware to back it up. It's an understandable thing, and something that I disagree with simultaneously. I do love the idea of having some kind of rig. I mentioned in the other video, I believe VR is actually a much better way of achieving that, because, I mean, let's be honest, unless you have some rodeo bull style sim setup for a motorcycle where you can lean through corners with all these complex pistons, a machine which ultimately would have a ridiculous price anyway, well then there's no other way of really getting that experience. And even then, you'd probably have to augment that with a VR headset anyway. So why not just have VR be the route to making a Tourist Trophy 2 achieve the kind of realism that he wants anyway? At least that's my 2 cents. Looking back to this first game though, I believe that the one thing Polyphony really could and definitely should have learned from this game is that sometimes leave well enough alone. Sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Tourist Trophy is just GT4 with bikes. That's why it's good. It didn't need to be something revolutionary, it just was a good game. It's kind of like, for example, when somebody makes a fantastic car platform that might have 2 doors or 4 doors, and then they evolve it into another platform or another variant that's different. They don't necessarily have to remake everything from the ground up. If it was already good, then you can make a new variation on the idea which is different enough to be justified, but also retains the greatness. I think that they could have done that, or at least carried over those principles to a sequel, and I'm hoping that if we ever do get it, they kind of will. It's certainly in his mind to do that, so the seeds of achieving greatness again are definitely there. And ironically, aside from his goals of the hardware issue being fixed, which I honestly don't think is going to happen anytime soon, if at all to that degree, if that were to happen, I do believe that a Tourist Trophy sequel could be a better sequel than the more recent Gran Turismo games have been for the Gran Turismo series, because Gran Turismo is so massive and the stakes are so high that those of us who do love it are almost impossible to please in many cases. Whereas with Tourist Trophy, because we've only had one, because it's so far removed, and because so many people have never played it, or barely have a memory of playing it because it was so long ago, the stakes are much lower, which means success would be that much easier to reach. Ultimately, I think that the first game was fantastic, still is fantastic, and even though jumping back into it you might find the physics take you a bit longer to get used to than the GT4, and for me personally the lack of a conventional career mode means it feels a little bit more shallow than the equivalent Gran Turismo experience, but ultimately the bare bones of what make Tourist Trophy so good have aged very well. The graphics still look great for its time, the bike selection is outstanding, there are some notable exceptions in terms of types of bike, like big Harley style cruisers cruisers, for example, but even then, it is a racing game first and foremost, so it's a forgivable omission, and there are both lower end and higher end road and race bikes, with some bikes that you can't even see in the dealerships. Very traditional Gran Turismo style there, where there are completely secret vehicles to win, which I personally love. And of course, things like that would probably be lost to time, unfortunately, because no one seems to really do that in games anymore. But there is a lot to love, both from the nostalgia perspective, wherein it is definitely a game that holds up very well, but also in terms of being a game that does something, again, to touch on the whole thing that I've talked about here and to sum it up all in one point. One of the things that I like to live by, one of the things that I recommended other people should live by, and I'm sure I'm not the only person to ever say this, of course not. If you want to be successful at anything in life, you really have two primary ways of doing it. You can either do what other people are doing better than them, or do something that no one else is doing. Gran Turismo is the former. It's doing what others are doing and it's trying to do it better, or at least it's doing it in its own way, which happens to be better in many ways, compared to a Forza, AC, Project Cars, whatever. Tourist Trophy is not in that camp. Tourist Trophy wasn't taking on any other bike game because there was no other bike game at that level. They were just basically MotoGP games, or then games that happened to have bikes like Project Gotham and Test Drive. Certainly not rivals for it. Now, with a Tourist Trophy 2, it would now be competing with Ride, and that's where things would get interesting. I do, however, think that could be a good thing. So sometimes healthy competition can up the bar. In fact, often it will improve the standard overall of a game, and I think that might happen with the Tourist Trophy 2. Going up against Ride, which the first game never had to, could make it even better. But I guess ultimately we'll have to wait and see. I personally do not have high hopes for a sequel anytime soon, unfortunately, but at least we still have the original. And it is a fantastic game. So if you haven't had the chance to play the first game, I would recommend trying it out. And of course, for those of you who do have fond memories of it, or maybe even if you didn't like it, drop down below what your thoughts on it are. Maybe if you've played it recently, maybe if it's been a long time, or especially if you've never played it or perhaps never heard of it, and this video might have put you onto it. Thanks once again to Ness for some of the footage here, and of course, if you enjoyed this essay, then be sure to check out the other ones which I've done for the aforementioned Drive Club, Driver San Francisco, Test Drive Unlimited, more recently Road Trip Adventure, and doubtless more in future as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.